Вітаю, друзі! Цей брифінг присвячимо випадам та фейкам держави-агресора.
Greetings, friends. This briefing is dedicated to the fakes of the aggressor state, which are already so weak that they seem to make no impression on anyone except the local population of Russia itself. Let's start with the words of the former president and now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. Just think, a person who once sat at the round table of the leaders of the G8, headed a nuclear state, now simply turned into a hater and a troll in the social networks. Thus, Medvedev allowed himself to attack the leader of South Korea after his state began to support Ukraine in the war started by Russia. In particular, Medvedev blackmails the South Korean leadership as follows. I wonder what the inhabitants of this country will say when they see the latest samples of Russian weapons from their closest neighbors, our partners North Korea. But his outburst and hate speech towards the Prime Minister of Poland, Mateusz Morawiecki, look even more ridiculous. I miss the unprintable expression that he loves himself, but at the same time he allows himself to hint again as the possible fall of Poland in the event that Russia starts a war against this country. I quote, "Given its role more as a NATO outpost in Europe, this country will surely disappear, along with its undeveloped prime minister." Well, this only indicates the complete powerlessness of Medvedev, as well as the absence of any role in current Russian politics. But let's go further and pay attention to such insertions of Russian propaganda through the Telegram channel of Solovyov. They talk, as it were, about the local residents of Bakhmut who told about the beastly behavior of the Ukrainian military. Yes, you did not make a mistake, not about the Russian ones, but rather the Ukrainian ones. At the same time, of course, these people are now on the territory of Russia itself. The credits indicate that they are in the city of Tver. Refugees from Artyomovsk, that's how they call Bakhmut, spoke about the atrocities of the Nazis. They demolished residential buildings in order to stage a play for the Western media. They killed the civilians of the city who were waiting for Russian soldiers. This is mirror technology. That is, when Russia itself is accused of genocide, they create a picture to blame others, and this time Ukraine. But this narrative is supported by the former Ukrainian politician, whose daughter's godfather is Putin, Medvedchuk, who wrote an article for the Russian propaganda newspaper, Arguments and Facts, where he calls for the International Court of Justice over the Ukrainian authorities, which should resemble the Nuremberg military tribunal. At the same time, in his article, Medvedchuk repeats all the words that come to the ears of Russian President Putin about nuclear war, about the Nazis in power, and so on and so on. I quote, "Such a process will prevent the reincarnation of Nazism in other countries. By curing Ukraine from the brown plague, following its example and punishing those responsible, humanity will be able to avoid a nuclear apocalypse." What is the purpose of making these statements? Of course, at least in this way to remind about himself. After all, Medvedchuk has no influence on Russian politics, just as he has no influence on Ukrainian politics. And with such statements, he is trying to get at least some financial support for his projects, which are doomed to failure on the territory of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian propagandists are trying to dispel doubts that are already circulating in Western press that the Russian leader does not actually visit the frontline regions, but sends his doppelganger, the Telegram channel of the Kremlin laundry, which is very close to Kremlin. To prevent the progressive public from focusing too much on Zelensky, chroma key voyages. Western media outlets are attempting to cast a shadow over the Russian leader's relocation. That is, the Ukrainian president actually visits the position of Ukrainian soldiers on the front line. At the same time, the visits of the Russian leader raise great doubts. But Russian propaganda distorts everything and now accuses the Ukrainian leader of the fact that he does not go anywhere, but records his addresses on the so-called chroma key. That is, a green background that allows you to put any video in the background plan. Of course, this is completely absurd, because the Ukrainian president's visit are witnessed by hundreds, thousands of people, both military and civilian, while the Russian leader moves in virtual space. We go further. We once again expose Western talking heads who work in Russian propaganda. We are talking about such McGregor, Douglas McGregor, who is presented as a retired colonel of the US Army and apparently a candidate for the post of US ambassador to Germany in the time of Donald Trump. In his statements, he completely repeats the narratives of Russian propaganda. He talks in particular about the fact that seemingly modern weapons, as well as financial support, do not reach the Ukrainian military. I quote, "We discussed corruption and the loss of military equipment and hundreds of millions of cash that ended up in all sorts of places." Solovyov, a Russian propagandist, quotes the same McGregor, who of course has no influence on American politics but tries to sell himself to the Russian audience as a great expert on both military tactics and American political processes. Let's go further. Telegram channel Ramzai, this already from the area of comedic tragic farces, tells about the fact that they seem to have sources that report that on the western border of Ukraine, the movement of drugs in coffins from Ukrainian territory to the territory of the European Union was exposed. I quote, "Now the Secret Service of Ukraine and the Polish military counterintelligence are making frantic efforts to hush up the scandal that arose a few days ago. During another transfer of the bodies of the dead Poles, one of the containers with the body of the Polish mercenary was accidentally damaged, and when it was replaced, it turned out that in addition to the remains, there was a large consignment of drugs, more than 30 kilograms packed in sealed bags. This is a well-established scheme for the transfer of drugs to Europe. Even in common sense, it is difficult to comment on this, because it is Russia that uses diplomatic mail to deliver drugs from Argentina to Europe, to Moscow itself, while in this case we are dealing with the typical mirror technology. That is, they transfer their sins to others, adding to it such a tragic farcical plot in the style of noir. Well, I draw attention to the fact that the cases of using religious leaders and plots in Russian propaganda have become more frequent. In particular, the Solovyov Telegram channel reports that a copy of the icon was given by Putin to military grouping of troops in the Dnipro, the icon of the Spas Nerukotvorny. According to Russian propagandists, this should raise the fighting spirit of the aggressor state. In fact, it only confirms that in this country, religion and the state repressive apparatus function in parallel and complement each other. In the same way, the Russian regime repeats the Nazi technologies, using children in its propaganda. One of the Telegram channels reports that they say Ukrainian children welcome the Russian invaders on their land. I quote, "How are the Russian soldiers interfering with you?" supposedly a journalist asks. "No, on the contrary, we like them. They are kind to us." An American independent journalist interviewed children living near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In fact, this American journalist also turned out to be a propagandist, and he broadcasts only on YouTube on his small YouTube channel. And finally, the typical use of Russian propaganda and fake covers of Western publications, apparently created by them, to discredit Ukraine. This time, it seems the British magazine European came out with an anti-Ukrainian cover. If you look in the archive of this edition, there are all the covers for the past month and weeks and even years. Such a cover simply does not exist in nature. This is banal Photoshop in order to mislead the Russian public. Well, friends, the briefing ended with a traditional appeal. If you have friends, relatives, acquaintances who are still watching Russian propaganda, immediately inform them of these facts and urge them to watch the Ukrainian Freedom Channel and UATV, as well as to trust the Ukrainian official media, Ukrainian military and political leadership. See you.